Okay, this video is going to aim to go through paper 2, Edexcel, Elizabethan England. Now, this aims to cover the whole course. So what you need to do is to scroll through this video and to see which areas of the course you need support with on the lead up to your GCSEs. Now, with Elizabethan, there's 3 units. It covers 20% of your GCSE. It's Queen, Government and Religion, Challenges to Elizabeth at Home and Abroad, and Elizabethan Society in the Age of Exploration. Now, within your GCSE, you will answer 3 questions on this: describe 2 features, and explain why 12 marker, and a 16 mark, how far do you agree? The only difference with this 16 marker is, unlike paper 1 and paper 3, there are no spelling, punctuation, and grammar marks. So we're going to get straight in and straight started. So I'm going to try and summarize each page. Now, obviously, if you're doing this on a computer, it'd be good to pause it, have a look at it. There's a lot of information on each page, but I'm going to go through the key features. So the first lesson that we would have covered is what society and government were like. Now, by society, it means who lived there and how a hierarchy worked. And with government, it's who helped Elizabeth control. Now, you could get 2 features questions on either of these. So 1558 was a very different time. We need to understand that life expectancy was low. It was only 28, between 28 and 41. People would still expect to follow the official Christian religion of the monarch. So whatever religion the monarch was, people were expected to follow it, or they would be committing treason. England was a very violent place. It didn't really have an effective police force or a permanent army. Majority of the people were poor, and nobody believed in equality. And what there was a strict social hierarchy. So basically, a lot of this time, it's where you were born into. So if you were born poor, no matter how skilled you were, you'd be expected to remain poor. Elizabethan government and society were also very structured. Now, the purpose of this was to help Elizabeth rule the country effectively. So the features of a society, very clear. So we've got that the monarch was at the top, which again is expected. So we're just going to underline some key points. So the monarch was at the top, followed by the nobility. The nobility were other people in the wider royal family. So think of the royal family today. We've got King Charles. Prince William would be known as a member of the nobility because he was in the wider royal family. Then below that, you've got the gentry, people who had lots of land. The ownership of land showed how much power you had. So that's the most important thing at this time. Land equaled power. Then you've got the yeomen or yeoman farmers who had smaller pieces of land, which they would work. Tenant farmers would rent land from the yeomans, and then you had the labouring poor. At the really bottom of society are the vagrants and the vagabonds, people who, which we'll go on to a bit later, out of work, homeless, and had to beg or steal to survive. In the towns, people who traded goods from abroad, known as merchants, were also really important. And alongside lawyers, doctors, they would always be men. But this group were the only ones that had a proper access to education. One feature of the Elizabethan society was the fact the husband and father was the head of the home, and the wife and child were expected to obey them. Now, ultimately, whoever you were, you had to respect your place in society. If you didn't, it's a crime against power, crime against authority. It was seen as impossible to move into a higher place in society. So ultimately, the one thing you've got to understand is, if you are, say, for example, a yeoman, it's very unlikely you'll move above, but the people above the yeoman had to look after the people below them. So it was expected that if you were higher than people, you'd look after them. You also then have Elizabethan government. So Elizabethan government was very different. Now, Elizabeth, as we know, had the divine right of monarchs, meaning that God effectively appointed them. So Elizabeth made a lot of decisions on her own, like declaring war. And this was called a proclamation. If Elizabeth didn't want government discussing anything she didn't want, she could say so. Now, the most important person in her government was the Secretary of State. And this man was, the first one was Sir William Cecil. He gave her advice. He was the most trusted member of the Privy Council. And after him, Walsingham took over. We know Walsingham to be her key #1 spy master. Now, the feature of government had different strands. So we had the courts, who lived with the monarch and were members of nobility. They were close friends. They had massive influences over what Elizabeth said and did. Remember, Elizabeth had the final call. You had the Privy Council, who had 19 members of the Privy Council, chosen by Elizabeth. They met 3 times a week, and they'd make sure that the decisions that Elizabeth made were carried out. Parliament. The Parliament's very different to what we have today. There were 2 houses, the House of Commons and the House of Lords. Parliament gave permission for Elizabeth to tax the people. They voted on laws and gave further advice, but they only met 10 times in the time that Elizabeth was queen. But they rarely voted against her. And then you also had the Justices of the Peace, who were basically people who were yeomen or landowners who kept law and order. This is why law and order wasn't brilliant. Unpaid, they report to the Privy Council, laws were followed, taxes were paid. They could put people on trial if they thought the crime was bad enough. But remember, crime and punishment in this period was very poor. So you could get a question on society, and within that, understand the key features of how it worked, and also how did Elizabeth's government work as well. Now, I'm not going to spend ages on this because this is probably one of the easiest things to understand, but what were the challenges faced by Elizabeth at home? So we need to understand 2 strands here. What challenges did she face in England? And then what challenges did she face abroad? You could get a question on this, and you need to look really carefully at the question, at the wording of the question, to make sure you get right the abroad and at home challenges. There is some crossover, so that's really important. So there were many challenges that Elizabeth faced when she became the queen. None so more that her legitimacy was being questioned. The legal reasons for her becoming the queen were questioned by some. So Catholics in England and abroad didn't support her father's divorce from Catherine of Aragon. So ultimately, Elizabeth was born out of wedlock, and as a result of a divorce between Henry and Catherine of Aragon. So they believed that the marriage between Henry and Anne Boleyn, who is Elizabeth's mum, wasn't legal, which makes Elizabeth a bastard child. This meant that Elizabeth had no legal right to become the queen, as people saw her mother and father as not legally married when she was born. Marriage is also another key trend that goes to the problems. Now, it's expected in society that as a woman and as a queen, that Elizabeth should marry. Now, Elizabeth could only marry a man from an equal status. So basically, she had to marry a prince or a king of another country. However, Elizabeth was very independent and powerful. And she believed that marrying a king or a prince from another country would put England in a threatening position. Philip II of Spain offered to marry Elizabeth, but she turned that down. This is where the Virgin Queen argument comes from, because she wanted to be married to her country. The Privy Council and Parliament put a lot of pressure on Elizabeth to marry, because they believed that if she didn't, then it would develop more threats and possibly ruin the stability of the country. The economy was another problem. So Elizabeth did inherit quite a significant amount of debt, 300,000. And to raise money in this period, you'd have to tax people. Well, taxing people isn't always going to be popular. So this became a challenge because she needed money to protect England, but she didn't have a significant amount of income coming in. There were lots of wars fought before her, which meant that she was in a poor position. To be stronger, Elizabeth needed to be wealthy, and ultimately there were some problems with this. Her personality isn't really a problem. The only thing it did was it possibly caused other people to question her. So she was confident, intelligent, charismatic, but some people believe she took too long to make decisions and she hesitated, which caused frustration. It also supported the fact that some people believed that women weren't capable of ruling because of their emotions. Now, the next four do link. Now, I'll jump to children because it does link to marriage. Many people wanted Elizabeth to have an heir to the throne. Now, a lot of people believed if she didn't have an heir to the throne, it would also mean she'd be vulnerable to attack and assassination. When we go to Mary Queen of Scots' argument, a lot of people believe that Mary Queen of Scots was going to have a child, which made the stability of the throne a lot stronger. Now, with a child, if anything happened to Elizabeth, they'd continue the Tudor monarchy. Without one, it was a very unstable country. So once again, the Privy Council put a lot of pressure on her to have children at the start of her reign, similar to the marriage aspect. Religion was a constant problem. So Catholics were already angry with her father for starting his own Protestant Church of England. And the Reformation, which led to England becoming a Protestant country, not a Catholic. The Pope caused challenges, and the Pope strongly influenced many English Catholics. There's going to be a big argument on that later on when we look at the actions of the Pope, which led to problems for Elizabeth. Gender, it was very unusual in history for a woman to be ruling rather than a man. Women were seen as inferior. Many people had the same attitude towards Elizabeth, that she was a woman, she should have a man, she should have a child, her gender held her back. And women weren't seen as strong enough mentally or physically. And it does link to the fact that previous Tudor women probably didn't help the matter. So Mary I was a big problem. Bloody Mary was a big problem because she was strict, she was evil, she executed people for their religion. And Mary had caused hunger, poverty, lost war, and put England into a significant amount of debt. So ultimately, a lot of people thought that Elizabeth would do the same. So the problems she faced were significant at the start. Now we look at the challenges from abroad. Now, challenges from abroad, again, you need to be very careful with the wording of it. So we've got threat from France, threat from Scotland, threat from the Pope, and threat from Spain. Now, most of these do have crossover reasons to the last slide. So we're just going to look at a few of them, and then we're going to develop a little bit more explanation. So the threat from France is five strands, sorry. And if the exam board was feeling quite harsh, they could do an explain question just on explain why there was a challenge from France to Elizabeth. I very much doubt it, because that would really limit the scope, but who knows? So the threat from France was wealthier than England. It had a bigger population, and they were the traditional enemy. Elizabeth was worried that if France would win a war if that was to happen. You've also got the French threat number 2. France had a very strong relationship with Scotland, and it was called the Old Alliance. Scotland also was a significant enemy to England at times, which threatened the power, because Scotland were at the north, France were the south. If they decide to continue their alliance, England could be in a lot of trouble. Further to this, the Old Alliance was strict Catholic countries. So they sided against Elizabeth, who showed more support for the Protestant Church. Many Catholics wanted to return England back to Catholicism. However, that didn't happen because of Elizabeth being in charge. However, a lot of the plots that we talk about, the Northern Earls, etc., all stem around that fact. The Catholic French king, Francis II, was also engaged to the monarch Mary Queen of Scots, the Scottish monarch, which would bring the two countries closer together. Now, it was a big problem because Mary Queen of Scots had a very strong claim to the English throne. So again, we'll talk about that a little bit more later on when we focus on the Mary Queen of Scots aspect. And then England had taken control of an area in France called Calais. It was important for Elizabeth's pride and for her trade for the rest of Europe, but it was always under threat of France taking it back. England had something that France wanted. Then you've got the Scottish threat. So again, linking back over to what we just spoke there about the Old Alliance, the monarch, Mary Queen of Scots, believed she was a more legitimate heir to the throne. She and her supporters again said Elizabeth was a bastard child, She was heavily supported by Catholics in England, Scotland, and France and Spain. The border between Scotland and England was difficult for the English to defend, as it was a very long distance away from London. So that's where the majority of the army and the monarch would be. Scotland had a very significant advantage due to this. There were lots of Scottish raids happening over the border. And then Mary, Queen of Scots' mother, called Mary of Guise, who was French, also spent time in Scotland, but she brought over French troops to help the fighting against English. So the Scottish army also had the help of the French against the English border. So the threat of France and the threat of Scotland are two very similar threats that you can link. The threat from the Pope. Now remember, the Pope is one of the most powerful men in regards to Catholicism. So despite the poor communication methods and modes of transport, the head of the Catholic Church still had huge control. The Pope used his power to his advantage to ask Catholics to challenge Elizabeth, and he also talks about the dislike of the Reformation that her father had introduced. The Pope wanted to have a counter-Reformation, meaning he wanted all European Catholics to stop the spread of Protestants. And Elizabeth was worried that could influence Catholics to challenge her rule. And the Pope also was willing to offer support to places like France and Spain. Again, we talk about that a bit later with the plots against Elizabeth. Spain was a very strict and powerful, wealthy. No, sorry, Spain is the last one. Now, Spain is an ongoing issue in this course. Now, Spain was a strict, powerful, and wealthy Catholic country, probably one of the most wealthy in whole of Europe. Supported Mary, Queen of Scots, who was the rightful Queen of England, who a lot of people believed, and Elizabeth was worried that Spain might join forces with France and Scotland to become an even bigger threat. So if you understand the threats to Elizabeth when she becomes the Queen, they are quite significant. Now, I'm not going to go through this next one, but we do need to understand there were a lot of religious divisions in England when Elizabeth became the Queen. That causes more problems. So I'm just going to briefly summarize here that what we've got on this page is a difference between the Catholic beliefs and the Protestant beliefs. So just touch upon a few that might cause problems. So I'll get the spotlight on this one here. No Pope for Protestants. Well, clearly the Pope is one of the most powerful men. This is going to cause significant problems, especially as Elizabeth is a Protestant. The amount of religious sacraments are so vastly different. Church services are different. Simple vestments versus religious colourful vestments, which we need to address in the religious settlement when Elizabeth introduces this in 1559. There were also parts of England that were very divided. So like in the north of England, Yorkshire, Lancashire, Durham, religion was very Catholic. So despite Elizabeth being in charge, there was a big division with the Catholic Church to the Protestant. And really, countries such as Spain and France remained Catholic. They persecuted Protestants. So what you need to understand is that despite Elizabeth being the Queen, there was still significant problems in the divisions of religion, not just within England, but within the whole of Europe, because the Pope wanted to have that counter-reformation. Now, as a result, Elizabeth had a decision to make, and Elizabeth's decision was to introduce something to have a middle way. She wanted to develop Protestantism, but have a compromise so that people didn't go against her. So to do this, she introduced her religious settlement. Now, her religious settlement, there were three parts to it. And again, it has come up before, so I very much doubt it would come up in the 2023 series, but you can't assume it wouldn't. So the three areas of... Now, you might get an interesting question, I don't know, just off the top of my head. Explain why the religious settlement was introduced in 1559. And then you've got all the religious reasons that you can talk about in the last two slides, the religious divisions, the difference between Catholic and Protestant, the threat that religion presented Elizabeth when she became the Queen in 1558. Quite a bit to talk about there. Now, The Act of Supremacy, the Act of Uniformity, and the Royal Injunctions were the three areas of the religious settlement. Again, I won't go through them all in masses of detail, but the Act of Supremacy made Elizabeth the supreme leader. So people had to swear an oath. The High Commission was created, who made sure that clergy did as they were told, and anyone who didn't follow it were punished. The Act of Uniformity gave rules for what a church should look like and what the church services should be like. Being uniform meant everyone being the same. So the Act of Uniformity, concept of uniform, the act of being the same. So you had the Bible or the Book of Common Prayer. That was used in all churches and written in English. You had clothing for priests. They wore special decorative clothing, vestments. That's a Catholic aspect, which led to some extreme Protestant opposition, which we'll talk about on the next slide. And everyone had to go to church on a Sunday. And then the Royal Injunction was a set of instructions about how to follow it. So the clergy were ordered to teach about the religious settlement. Each church was to have a copy of the Common Prayer Book in English. Pilgrimages to holy places were banned, as it was more of a Catholic practice, but Elizabeth did allow some images of Christ in the church. So she was trying to find a middle way, have aspects of Catholicism while still enforcing her Protestant beliefs. So 80% accepted the religious settlement, but many Catholic bishops opposed it. Elizabeth did sack them and appoint 27 new Protestant bishops, but we're going to look at the response to the religious settlement on the next slide. Now, the role of the church, again, there's a lot here going on, but I'm not going to talk through it all. So the role of the church in enforcing the religious settlement, what we need to understand is that people that work for the church had to enforce this to ensure that it worked. But Catholic bishops were very different. So it says at the top there, all members of the church had taken an oath of supremacy. If they refused, they'd be dismissed. 80% took the oath, meaning the religious settlement was largely successful. But more traditional bishops were different. Only one agreed. So the others had to step down, which meant Elizabeth was in a stronger position because she could put Protestant bishops in place. Ordinary people, most people accepted the settlement and attended the new Church of England services. But how did the church help enforce the rules? So punishment, okay, yes, that would happen if people didn't follow it. A license. Priests need a license to preach from the government, so they wouldn't be given a different message. Loyalty. If you had a license, you had an oath towards Elizabeth. You had visitation, so people would randomly spot check the churches to ensure that the Act of Supremacy and Act of Uniformity would be followed. Big weakness there, they'd only happen every 3 to 4 years. And the role of the church had significance. So they were powerful, they collected tithes, they helped people in times of need with money, deaths, poor harvests. They held religious ceremonies such as weddings, funerals, births, and baptisms. They deal with social issues such as poverty, begging, and they deal with crime and punishment with church courses. Church courts. So they were very important still, but the main job of the church was to enforce the religious settlement. Now, as a result, there was opposition, both from a Catholic point of view and a Protestant point of view. The extreme Protestant view was known as Puritans. Puritans, who were extreme Protestants, wanted to get rid of all the Catholic religion. The Puritans wanted religion to be controlled by the monarch. Now, remember, they cannot happen because if Elizabeth decided to be too strict with her religion, she would have had more rebellions on her hands. So what did Puritans challenge? So, Puritan challenge 1 was the use of the crucifix. The Puritans didn't like decorative ornaments in churches and wanted the image of Christ to be on the cross to be removed. Some Puritans threatened to resign. So what did Elizabeth do? Elizabeth did like the image of the crucifix and wanted them to stay, but After the threat of Puritans, she gave in and said there was no way to enforce every church having a crucifix. As a result, the Puritans were happy. The second thing was the use of vestments, religious clothing. So Elizabeth wanted clergy to wear special clothing. She liked the imagery and how it made the clergy look important. The Puritans didn't like it because they believed that the clergy shouldn't look more important and that members of clergy were just as equal to the ordinary people, and it was God who was important, not the clergy. However, Elizabeth did not give in and said they had to wear the vestments. She had the Archbishop of Canterbury put on an exhibition to show off the vestments. And then she put on a special event. 110 Puritans were invited. 37 of them refused to attend, and Elizabeth punished them by dismissing them. The key thing is Elizabeth stood her ground. She tried to ensure that people did what she said, and if they didn't, she would enforce it through a punishment of them losing power, not their life at this stage. So following Elizabeth's actions, few Puritans actually did challenge Elizabeth's religious settlement. They would risk their jobs. It shows with 37 clergymen losing it after the vestment. Puritans were only active and threatened the power in the southeast of England. How much of a threat were they? I would say minimal at this stage. But the threat they did pose, Elizabeth dealt with very, very well. Okay, now, the Catholic challenge to the religious settlement. So again, if the exam board are feeling not very friendly for this exam, you might say, explain why there was a Catholic challenge to the religious settlement. It wouldn't be very pleasant. However, you've got to be prepared for any question. So what we need to understand is there were still lots of Catholics living in England and they wanted to threaten Elizabeth. They were also influenced by the Pope. So what was their reaction to the religious settlement? So the influence of the Pope, we know this, that the Pope is the leader of the Catholic Church and he wanted a counter-reformation. The Pope may have spoken from Rome, but he had a massive influence. So in 1566, the Pope issued official instructions to Catholics in England, which said don't attend the church services. He called them recusants, the people that did. And the Pope also supported Catholic communities by persecuting Protestants. So the Pope wouldn't have supported a lot of the actions of Elizabeth's religious settlement. Then you had the threat of the English nobles, gentry, and earls. Now remember, they had significant land all across England. So the nobility, the gentry, and the earls were at the very top. They owned huge amounts of land. A large number were in the north, and they were heavily influenced by the Pope's instructions. Following the Pope telling them not to go to Church of England services, about 33% of them became recusants after the Pope's instructions. So getting a fine for not attending church, but because they were so rich, it didn't really matter. What we need to understand as well is that a lot of these Catholic nobles had so much power before Elizabeth that when she became the queen, they lost a lot of power. They wanted to challenge the religious settlement as a way of them showing they don't like Elizabeth. How threatening was that challenge? A lot more than the Puritans. So how far were the English Catholics a threat? So the Pope could only influence them so much because he lived so far away. Messages did take quite a while to get to England. Most ordinary English Catholics adapted to the religious settlement. Ordinary people just didn't question because ultimately they would have had a punishment. However, we will discover, as we do know already, that in 1969 there was the revolt of the Northern Earls, where people tried to revolt against Elizabeth. This was one key reason why. Elizabeth didn't react in a strict way to people who didn't attend her services. She realised that if she acted too harshly, that ultimately she'd have a bigger problem on her hands. And around 33% of the Catholic nobility and gentry were recusants. But at this stage, they were too far away from Elizabeth to be an active threat, being majority of them in the north. So the Catholic threat was more significant than the Protestant threat. And that big threat there did come from the Pope and his instructions. Now I'm going to do another 3 slides, and then I'm going to do a part 2 video. So the next stage we need to look at is, what was the Catholic challenge from abroad to the religious settlement? And with this, we need to look at Scotland, Spain, France, Rome, and the Netherlands. Now, the Netherlands are a totally separate entity, which we will look at. But again, there's a lot of crossover here. So Scotland had a strong Catholic faith following because of Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary, Queen of Scots had strong links to France after she married Francis II. And there were so many Catholic Scottish nobles who'd be willing to support Mary in gaining control of Protestant England. They wouldn't have liked this religious settlement. Spain, also, wealthiest countries in Europe, strictly Catholic. The leader, Philip II, once had strong links with England as he was married to Mary I. He also proposed to Elizabeth, but she refused. Spain began to challenge more after the religious settlement and became more angry because Elizabeth started to support the Netherlands. France, massive conflict between Catholics and Protestants in France. So in 1562, Elizabeth promised to help the French Protestants. She hoped the French would reward her by returning the part of Calais back to English control, but it didn't happen. To make matters worse, the Catholics came to power in France, and Elizabeth was forced to sign something called the Treaty of Troyes, which gave Calais back to the French. It made Elizabeth look weak. Then you've got Rome. I mean, shock horror, the Pope, you know straight away, as we've talked about, the Pope put that instruction out in 1566, and in 1570, he excommunicated Elizabeth a year after the religious settlement, which meant she wasn't part of the Catholic Church anymore, and she should be seen as an enemy and threat to Catholicism. I'm not going to talk through the Netherlands because that's going to be in part 2. Now, the last 3 slides are just going to talk about Mary, Queen of Scots, and the revolts. So why was Mary, Queen of Scots, a threat to Elizabeth? It's, again, very similar to why Elizabeth had problems in Europe. So the legitimacy claim, all Catholics believed that Mary was the legal heir to the English throne. Elizabeth didn't have an heir. She had no children. She wasn't married. England were vulnerable to attack. But Elizabeth didn't name Mary, Queen of Scots, as her heir, which made Catholics even more angry. Catholic support for Mary. So because of the Pope, English Catholic nobles, France and Spain, there was a significant reason why Mary could challenge Elizabeth as the Queen of England. So Mary was one of Elizabeth's biggest challenges. If she did nothing, then it would only end in a way which probably would have led to Elizabeth losing her power. Mary had French links. So Mary had a link to the French king, Francis II. Her mother was also French, Mary of Guise. Mary was living in France with her husband. Her mother controlled Scotland for her. France had a lot of respect for Mary. Following the death of her husband, Francis II, Mary came back to Scotland, and there was a rumor that she was going to challenge Elizabeth with the support of the French, and ultimately that made her a threat to Elizabeth. The death of Francis II and her move back to Scotland made Mary unstable. It made her a massive risk to Elizabeth. And Scotland was traditionally more Catholic, so the chance is that Mary would gain enough support to overthrow England and Elizabeth. So what happened? So Mary's ruthless relationships is the last. So Mary did marry very quickly. After the death of her husband, she married her second husband, Lord Darnley. But it was a violent relationship, and there was a rumor that Mary had murdered Darnley in 1567. She then got married to Earl Bothwell, but it didn't go well. So the Protestant lords in Scotland got fed up with Mary, and she was forced to step down as queen. Protestants put Mary in prison on an island in the middle of a lake. Now, this is where she fled to England to get help from Elizabeth, but it didn't happen that way. So if we look on the far side, what did Elizabeth do following this? So Elizabeth sent money and troops to help Protestants in Scotland fight against Catholics. In 1560, Elizabeth made Mary Queen of Scots sign an agreement called the Treaty of Edinburgh. Mary gave up her claim to the English throne. When Mary did flee to England to ask Elizabeth for help, Elizabeth put Mary under house arrest, so she was guarded at all times. But she was not executed, because if she were executed, she could have started a significant religious war because of the reasons we spoke about. The strange thing and the interesting fact, history is still important to know about this, is that despite there are a lot of talk between Elizabeth and Mary Queen of Scots, they never actually met. They only communicated through letters, and Mary Queen of Scots would send Elizabeth gifts as a way to try and gain her trust. So the next part, before we move on to part 2, are the plots. So the Revolt of the Northern Elves and the failure of Rodolphi, Throckmorton, and Babington. And then the next part of the video, we'll talk about more Unit 2 detail about the reasons for Anglo-Spanish relationships being broken down, and go into the failure of the Armada, and then into the Unit 3 content. So the Revolt of the Northern Earls. Now, Elizabeth was crowned in 1558, her religious settlement 1559. So what we need to understand, 10 years after the religious settlement, this was one of the biggest threats to Elizabeth. It failed, but created more tension. So here are lots of different reasons. Now, all the causes are linked to religion, wealth, politics, geography, lots of different reasons. Again, if the exam board are feeling nasty, you could get explain why the revolt of the Northern Earls happened. So I'll go through some of these, then look at the revolt, and then we'll look at the other 3. So the reason we look at this in a bit more detail is because of the threat it provided. So I will just get the spotlight on here. So the rebellion happened in the north, as most people here remain Catholic. This is a religious reason. Elizabeth didn't name Mary, Queen of Scots, as her heir. The Earls wanted Mary as the next monarch. So even by not naming her as the heir, it caused problems. The Earls wanted to restore Catholic faith. The Northern Earls were basically doing what they've been told by the Pope, the Counter-Reformation. Mary, Queen of Scots, was under house arrest, and they believed they had an opportunity to free her and have a legitimate Catholic monarch. The group who started the revolt were Catholic nobles and earls who lost a lot of power when Elizabeth became the Queen. The Duke of Norfolk planned to marry Mary, Queen of Scots, and take the throne, which would provide Mary with even more power. Many Catholic earls and nobles had become recusants because they refused to go to the new church, which had been set up. They believed it did nothing. What they did nothing, so they needed something more extreme. Key Catholic earls, the Earl of Northumberland, the Earl of Westmoreland, lost influence, and they were jealous of Elizabeth's new favourites, William Cecil and Robert Dudley. And then you also have the wives of the Northern Earls, Jane Neville and Anne Percy, who hated how much power they lost. So they wanted their husbands to basically kick off and get their power back. Elizabeth chose a Protestant as the Archbishop of Durham. It was traditionally a Catholic town, and this again upset the Catholics in the north more. The Earls believed they had the support of Spain, and the Catholic Earls lost power and wealth when Elizabeth became the Queen. So a lot of the reasons why this revolt of the Northern Earls happened was down to religion and wealth. There was a lot of politics behind it, but mainly the fact they were unhappy at having a Protestant queen, and they were so upset at losing significant wealth. So what were the features of this revolt? So there's 12 steps here. Mary, Queen of Scots, marry the Duke of Norfolk. Mary then told the Spanish that she should be the Queen of England in 3 months. Elizabeth found out about the plan, and Norfolk was arrested. As a result, the Earl of Northumberland and Westmoreland reacted by starting the revolt in the north. They took over Durham Cathedral. They held a Catholic mass for 2 weeks. The Catholic rebels then carried on south with the aim of rescuing Mary from the prison. Elizabeth raised an army, 14,000 men, and caused them to flee back north. The Earls went to meet the Spanish troops, but the Spanish never arrived. 450 rebels were executed. Northumberland was executed in York and his head was put on a spike. That's a way of proving a point to say this will happen to you. Elizabeth was under pressure to execute Mary Queen of Scots, but she refused. But one of the biggest significant things here was that in 1570, the Pope issued a papal bull which excommunicated Elizabeth. So ultimately, remove Elizabeth from the throne. What Elizabeth then did was to pass a law that anyone that attempted to kill her was committing treason. And she also became harsher in the north by setting up the Council of the North, which said that anyone that didn't follow her religious settlement would be treated harshly. So 2 strands there. Why did it happen? And why did it fail? The other 3 plots are very similar in regards to their reasoning and their consequences. So the Ridolfi, the Throckmorton, and the Babington plot, all very similar. So the Ridolfi plot, the causes were that Elizabeth made laws against Catholics even tougher. The papal bull made Catholics want to rebel even more. And because of the papal bull, this Italian banker, Roberto Ridolfi, plotted a murder against Elizabeth. The features: Ridolfi was a spy for the Pope. He planned to murder Elizabeth in a Spanish invasion and put Mary in power. Ridolfi travelled to Spain. Spain-controlled Netherlands, discussed his plan with the Pope, Duke of Alba, and King Philip. Ridolfi was given support by the Duke of Norfolk, who said he would marry Mary Queen of Scots, which is exactly what he said in the other plot, and 10,000 troops to prepare for an invasion. Why did it fail? Cecil discovered the plot and was able to prove that the Duke of Norfolk was guilty of treason. The Duke of Norfolk was executed, but Mary Queen of Scots wasn't. Catholics were still a threat. Tougher laws were put in. The more this happened, the tougher Elizabeth became. So Ridolfi was plot number 1. Throckmorton, again, causes, because the laws became harsher because of Ridolfi and the papal bull. The plan was for the French Duke of Guise to come to England, free Mary, and make her queen. Philip promised to pay for the revolt. The Pope approved it, and an Englishman who was Catholic, Throckmorton, passed letters between Mary and the plotters. Why did it fail? Walsingham discovered the plot. He found letters in Throckmorton's house. He was arrested and executed. Now, the letters were more of a concern for Elizabeth. It showed how much hatred there was against her. It showed the threat from France and Spain. 11,000 Catholics were imprisoned following this. And a new law was put in place that if you protected a Catholic priest, you could be killed. There is a trend here. And the Babington plot. Again, what was the cause? The laws that Elizabeth put in after Throckmorton and the papal bull. The features of the plot: murder Elizabeth. The French Duke of Guise invade England with 60,000 men. Philip and the Pope supported the plot. And Catholic Babington wrote to Mary while she was under house arrest, but her letters were closely monitored. This is where they made the link and had proof that Mary was acceptant. So Walsingham discovered the plot when looking through letters sent to Mary, Queen of Scots. As a result, Babington was arrested and executed. 31 priests were executed across England, and Elizabeth finally signed Mary's death warrant in 1587, which would stop any more plots from happening to try and take Elizabeth's throne by replacing her with Mary. That's part 1 of Elizabethan England. Part 2 will go up shortly, which will look at the other parts of this course with a brief summary on each. Thanks very much.